Miss Marple, in the case of the burnt W.L. Hepter 1, a death at Marleycombe Hall. The village of Marleycombe had always seemed to exist in a pocket of time untouched by the outside world, with its moss-covered stone cottages, hedgerows filled with humming bees, and a church spire that pierced the sky like a needle through linen. Marleycombe was the sort of place where nothing too dramatic ever happened, which is why, when the bell of St. Luke's tolled twice on an unseasonably warm April morning, it felt like a ripple had spread through the air, subtle but unmistakably wrong. Word spread fast. Mr. Archibald Fane, the reclusive but exceedingly wealthy master of Marleycombe Hall, was dead. Heart failure, they say, murmured Mrs. Edith Barnstable, whose hairdresser's chair was the village's unofficial parliament. But he was only 62, and walking every morning, rain or shine. Said Mavis Clegg, her thin lips pursed in suspicion. And didn't he just change his will last month? Something about leaving everything to his housekeeper instead of his nephew? There was a silence, charged and curious. Edith leaned closer. And now they're saying the will's gone. Burnt, can you believe it? By tea-time, everyone in Marleycombe was talking. By sunset, the police were called. The next morning, Miss Jane Marple, sitting by her lace-curtained window with a tray of weak tea and brown toast, opened her post and saw a brief note in familiar shaky handwriting. Dear Miss Marple, something most distressing has occurred. I do hope you might come for a few days. It's not the same here without Archie, and there's talk I don't understand. Cordelia Miss Marple folded the letter slowly and looked out the window. The dew had not yet burned off the hedges. A pair of sparrows fought over a crumb on the garden path. And somewhere, in the soft shadows of a village she knew too well, someone was lying. She rose and began to pack. Chapter 2. The ashes of a document. Miss Marple arrived in Marleycombe the next afternoon, dressed in dove-gray tweed and carrying a small, worn suitcase. She looked like nothing more than a kindly spinster aunt, and that suited her just fine. Cordelia Fane greeted her at the door of Marleycombe Hall, pale and visibly frayed. The once elegant woman had aged in the 3 years since Miss Marple had last seen, her auburn hair now dulled with gray, her fingers trembling as she poured tea in the drawing-room. I didn't know who else to write to, she said in a voice that tried to be formal but faltered. It's all so strange, Jane, so sudden. Miss Marple gave her a gentle nod and took a sip of weak Earl Grey. Grief often clouds the ordinary, Cordelia. Tell me what happened quietly. Cordelia set her teacup down. Archie was fine that evening. We had dinner together, nothing remarkable. He read in the library for a while, then said he was going to bed, and next morning he was gone. The doctor said his heart just gave out. Miss Marple gave no reaction, only listened, hands folded in her lap. And then Cordelia continued, her voice now breaking. Julian arrived 2 hours later. And that's when the study was found unlocked. The new will. It was gone. They searched everywhere, but there were burnt papers in the hearth. Burnt papers? Miss Marple asked softly. Cordelia nodded. Charred flakes, nothing readable. Only the old will remains filed with Mr. Lathbury, the solicitor. And the old will favors Julian? Yes, entirely. But the new one, Archie told me just a week ago, he was going to leave a third to Mrs. Gall, his housekeeper, and another portion to the village hospital. He felt ashamed of how Julian had handled the estate. Miss Marple gently adjusted her shawl. And did anyone else know about the new will? I don't think so. Only Archie, myself, and perhaps Mrs. Gall. She was very loyal. There was a pause, and outside a blackbird gave a high, melancholy whistle. Was Julian alone when he arrived? Asked Miss Marple. Cordelia hesitated. No, the gardener let him in. said he saw Julian come through the side entrance and go straight to the study. But Julian claims he was simply looking for papers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so. Slightly. What time was this? Just after 7 in the morning. The housekeeper found Archie at 6:30. The doctor arrived at 7:15. The police later. Miss Marple rose and wandered slowly to the hearth. She knelt and ran her fingers lightly along the iron grate. There was still a scent, not of wood smoke, but something acrid. Charred. Paper and wax, perhaps. You didn't happen to see what was burnt? Cordelia shook her head. Only that the fire had been recently used. Odd, really, it was too warm that morning for a fire. Indeed, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. At that moment, the door opened, and Mrs. Gull entered, an upright, plain woman in her 50s, with a stiff back and tired eyes. "Tea, madam," she said. Then she caught sight of Miss Marple. "You must be Miss Jane. Cordelia's told me about you." "And I about you," said Miss Marple, smiling warmly. A woman who runs a house this size must have the patience of a saint and the memory of a librarian. Mrs. Gull allowed a small smile. More the memory than the saint, if I'm honest. Miss Marple's tone stayed light. "And did you, too, believe Mr. Fane would change his will?" There was the smallest flicker in Mrs. Gull's eyes, there and gone. "He mentioned it, yes, but I never asked for anything. He was generous to those who served him." Miss Marple nodded. "And the fire, Mrs. Gull, who lit it?" "I couldn't say. I didn't touch it. It was cold the night before, but I never saw it lit. By the time I entered the study in the morning, it was already burnt out." The housekeeper excused herself quietly. Miss Marple sat back down, stirring her tea with slow, thoughtful movements. Someone lit a fire early that morning. Someone who wanted to destroy something. Cordelia's hands twisted in her lap. "Do you think it was Julian?" "I think," Miss Marple said, looking toward the study door, "that we are in the presence of someone who knows the value of timing." And ashes. Outside, the blackbirds sang again, sharp, sweet, and solitary. Chapter 3. The Housekeeper's Inheritance. Following morning broke with the sound of rain, tapping softly on the tall windows of Marleycombe Hall. It was a gray, thin sort of rain, more mist than downpour, yet somehow enough to mute the world outside. Inside, the house felt just as hushed, like a stage before the curtain rose. Miss Marple, dressed immaculately in a powder blue blouse and her neatest brooch, made her way quietly to the breakfast room. Cordelia was already there, poking at her. Toast with no real appetite. "I hardly slept," Cordelia confessed. "I keep thinking about that fire, about the way Julian denied everything so calmly, as if he expected to inherit." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her hand steady. "Tell me, Cordelia, what exactly did Archie say about his will when you last spoke of it?" Cordelia frowned and rubbed her temples. "He told me quite clearly that he was making things right, that he'd spoken to Mr. Lathbury, and that the new will was signed. He didn't mention specifics, only that he'd grown disappointed in Julian's choices. He said he didn't want the house to rot under idle hands." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And Mrs. Gull?" "Archie trusted her. He said she kept the house alive. He mentioned a gift, perhaps a third of the estate. He believed loyalty should be rewarded." There was a knock at the door. The butler, Graves, poked his head in. "Inspector Latham is here to speak with you." "Madam." "Send him in," Cordelia said, sitting up straighter. The inspector entered, a lean man with ginger hair beginning to thin at the crown, and a long-suffering expression that said he'd dealt with far too many village squabbles. "Miss Fane," he greeted with a nod, "and you must be Miss Marple." "I must indeed," she said pleasantly. "I wanted to update you on the inquiry. We've confirmed that Mr. Fane's death was due to heart failure. Clean report from Dr. Percival. But I do have concerns about the destroyed will. Cordelia's voice caught. Have you found anything? Latham hesitated. We found fragments in the hearth. Just enough to confirm it was a legal document of some kind, traces of wax seal, signature remnants, parchment ash. Beyond that, nothing conclusive. If this was the new will, it's been thoroughly destroyed. He turned toward Miss Marple. You've dealt with these sorts of incidents before, haven't you? She smiled gently. Only in the manner of one who pays close attention to human nature, Inspector. You'd be surprised what people reveal when they think no one is listening. He gave a thin smile. People are already whispering. The housekeeper stands to gain from the new will. So did Miss Fane. And Julian Fane benefits most from the original. And who had opportunity? Miss Marple asked softly. Latham pulled out his notebook. Julian arrived early, as expected. The gardener saw him entering through the side gate at 7. Mrs. Gull says she was in the scullery around that time, though she admits she never saw Julian come in. I'd like to speak to Mrs. Gull myself, Miss Marple said. Of course, Cordelia agreed. She's in the sitting room. Mr. Peel squinted into the mist. That'd be Thursday, wouldn't it? I remember seeing Master Julian come in from the side. Bit earlier than usual. Said he wanted to check on some papers. Did you see him enter the study? I saw. The door close behind him, that's all. Didn't think much of it. But later when the inspector asked, I remembered he had soot on his cuff. Not a lot, just enough to show. Strange, don't you think? Miss Marple said, for someone. Simply fetching papers? Mr. Peel gave a shrug. I don't get into rich folks' habits, miss. I just plant and trim what I'm told. She thanked him and walked slowly back to the house. That evening, after supper, Miss Marple sat in the library while Cordelia played, absent-mindedly at the piano. Tell me, dear, Miss Marple asked, what was Mr. Fane reading the night before he died? Cordelia blinked, surprised. A book of essays by Bacon, I think. He was always quoting it. Said it gave him perspective. Did he seem ... anxious? Worried? Cordelia hesitated. Not anxious. Exactly. But ... unsettled. He asked me whether I thought people could die knowing something was left undone. He was clutching that new will. I saw it, Jane. I saw it on his desk. And now it's gone, Miss Marple said quietly. Like the truth swept under the rug. Cordelia shivered. You don't think someone in this house would have really burned it? I think, said Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the flickering fire in the grate, that desperation makes people do foolish things. But only guilt makes them hide it so very badly. Chapter 6. The locked study the next day. The weather lifted slightly, sunlight filtering through the clouds in shy patches. Miss Marple spent the morning walking the perimeter of Marleycombe. Hall's grounds, her thoughts as methodical as her steps. She returned just before lunch to find Inspector Latham once again at the hall, this time standing with Graves, the butler, just outside the study door. Miss Marple, the inspector greeted her. I was just speaking with Graves here about the state of the study the morning Mr. Fane died. It seems there's a bit of confusion over how the door was locked or unlocked, as it were. Ah, Miss Marple said mildly. And I imagine that's rather important, isn't it? Quite. Graves says the study was always locked at night. Mr. Fane had the only key on his watch chain. Graves cleared his throat, looking slightly flustered. Yes, madam. That was the habit. Mr. Fane would lock the study before retiring. Always. He was particular about his papers. And in the morning? Miss Marple asked. The morning Mr. Fane died, Graves continued, Mrs. Gull found him in his bed. He hadn't risen. Doctor was called. But when we went to check the study, it was already unlocked. That's when Julian came in. Miss Marple looked to Latham. And the key? Still on the watch chain. Still in Mr. Fane's waistcoat pocket, Latham confirmed, which means either someone else had a copy, or someone retrieved the key before the body was examined. Wouldn't that be rather difficult? Miss Marple asked. Unless they were here early and unobserved, Latham replied. Miss Marple tapped the doorframe gently. Or perhaps the key was borrowed, then returned. The inspector raised an eyebrow. That's a rather subtle distinction. And so are most motives, she replied. Her voice soft. After luncheon, Miss Marple took a walk with Cordelia down the gravel path toward the orchard, where pink blossoms were just beginning to fall like confetti. Cordelia looked tired, her arms folded tightly against the breeze. Julian's been so cold, she said. He claims to be grieving, but there's something behind his eyes, like calculation. Miss Marple nodded. Has he ever lived at the Hall? He stayed occasionally during childhood summers, Cordelia replied, but he always preferred the city. After his parents died, Uncle Archie became his guardian, but there was no love lost between them. Do you believe Julian knew about the new will? Cordelia hesitated. Archie never said so, but I wouldn't put it past Julian to suspect it. He always had a way of sniffing out opportunity. They turned down the rose lane, the scent heavy with last season's decay. Miss Marple slowed. Tell me, Cordelia, who else had access to Mr. Fane's study that night? No one, Cordelia sighed. It was locked. But if the fire was used that morning, and the key remained with Mr. Fane, someone must have found a way inside. Cordelia's eyes widened. You think it was Julian? I think, said Miss Marple, that if someone were desperate enough to destroy a will, they'd also be clever enough to return the key after the fact. Cordelia went quiet, and perhaps, Miss Marple added, they assumed no one would question the ashes in a morning fire. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the study. The scent of burnt paper still faintly lingered. She crouched near the hearth, examining the iron grate. Her fingers brushed against something small, a curl of blackened wax. She lifted it carefully and held it to the light. Red wax, she murmured. A seal, just as Lathbury said. Then her eyes fell upon the desk drawer, ajar by a hair. She opened it. Inside was a neat row of pens, a blotter, and a single white glove singed at the fingertip. She lifted it. It was delicate, too small for Julian's hand. A woman's glove. Chapter 7. Embers and Motives. That evening, Miss Marple sat in the library, with the glove laid carefully across her lap. The singed fingertip was subtle, but unmistakable, a half-moon of ash, curling up into scorched leather. It had been hidden, perhaps hurriedly, perhaps carelessly. But why? She folded it neatly into her knitting bag, just as Cordelia entered with 2 cups of chamomile tea. You've been quiet today, Cordelia remarked, handing her one of the cups. Thinking, Miss Marple said softly. It's surprising how little most people notice, but how much they reveal. Cordelia sat on the edge of the sofa. Do you think the police will arrest Julian? Miss Marple sipped her tea. Only if they find proof. Suspicion, even when shared by many, is not quite the same as evidence. Cordelia hesitated. Would a glove be enough? Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her cup. It might be, depending on whose glove it is. Cordelia's gaze dropped. It's not mine, if that's what you're thinking. I'm not thinking anything, Miss Marple said gently. Only considering who else might benefit from the will being destroyed. Cordelia stood and walked toward the hearth. She stared into the cold grate as if something still burned there. I loved Archie, you know, she said quietly. Not like a daughter, more like a friend. He gave me a second chance when no one else would. I never wanted his money. Miss Marple didn't interrupt, but I also didn't want it all to go to Julian, she added. He's cruel, Jane, not just spoiled cruel. He says things in a way that makes you feel like nothing. Miss Marple finally spoke. Cruelty is a form of carelessness with power, dangerous when paired with ambition. Cordelia turned. Do you think he did it? I think he might have, Miss Marple said, but he's clever. Too clever. To leave a woman's glove in the drawer. Cordelia's eyes narrowed. Then, you think it was a woman? Miss Marple only smiled and sipped her tea. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the village post office, where she happened upon Lorna Whitaker, the vicar's daughter. She was sorting envelopes behind the counter, her eyes shadowed. With fatigue, Miss Marple, she said with a small smile. What a week we're having, eh? Indeed, said Miss Marple, leaning slightly over the counter. A death, a fire, a will. Lorna blinked. You think someone burned the will? I think it would explain a great deal. Lorna hesitated. Then she leaned in. I saw Julian arguing with Mrs. Gull 2 days before Archie died. Oh? Near the orchard, Lorna whispered. It wasn't just a disagreement. He was furious. Said something about what's owed to people who serve, and she told him he'd regret treating her like dirt. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind was already moving. Did they notice you? Lorna shook her head. I was behind the hedge, delivering hymn sheets. But I remember how red Julian's face was, and Mrs. Gull, she was shaking. Thank you, dear, Miss Marple said. Sometimes the smallest arguments echo the loudest. That evening, she visited Mrs. Gull in the servants' quarters. The room was tidy to the point of sterility, a lace doily beneath every object, the air thick with lavender polish. The sitting room was dark and paneled with walnut, the kind of place that carried both history and hush. Mrs. Gull sat in a high-backed chair, knitting something dark gray. Her eyes lifted as Miss Marple entered, her needles continuing to click. Faintly, I imagine this is all quite unpleasant for you, Miss Marple began, easing into a seat nearby. I've been through worse, Mrs. Gull said flatly. But perhaps not quite like this, Miss Marple offered. You served Mr. Fane loyally for many years. Mrs. Gull nodded once. He was fair, stern, sometimes difficult. But he paid on time and never raised a hand. And he trusted you, Miss Marple said. So much so, he intended Chapter 4. A visitor with questions. The next morning arrived cloaked in early fog, the kind that clung low to the hedgerows and wrapped the village in a white hush. Miss Marple awoke before the house stirred and spent an hour in quiet reflection, knitting near her window, while the sun slowly fought its way through the mist dot. By the time she descended to the breakfast room, Julian Fane was there unannounced, and already helping himself to a second slice of ham. Miss Marple, he said without looking up, I gather you're here to represent Cordelia's interests. I hope you'll find your time here uneventful. She gave him a polite smile, folding her hands before her. Oh no, I'm not representing anyone's interest, Mr. Fane. I'm simply visiting an old friend during difficult times. Though, naturally, one notices things. Things? Julian raised an eyebrow as he buttered his toast with excessive care. What sort of things? Oh, nothing unusual. Human habits. What people say, and what they avoid saying. Her tone was pleasant, but unyielding. Julian's eyes narrowed just slightly. Well, I hope you won't mistake grief for guilt. I've been rather unfairly scrutinized already, I think. Miss Marple took her seat across from him, folding her napkin. Neatly, and how very unfortunate that must feel. But then again, I believe you were one of the last people to enter Mr. Fane's study the morning he died? His jaw tightened for a second before he answered. Yes, and the only reason I entered was to locate the deed to the cottage property. In Devon, Archie had spoken about selling it. I found nothing of use. And the fire? She asked casually, spreading marmalade on her toast. I noticed it had been used, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Ah, interesting, Miss Marple said. Gently. Julian stood abruptly, placing his cutlery down with just a touch. Too much force. I don't appreciate the insinuation, Miss Marple. No insinuation, Mr. Fane, she said mildly. Just an old woman's curiosity. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. That day, Miss Marple took a stroll through the village. The streets of Marleycombe were lined with ivy-covered walls and narrow lanes, where whispers traveled faster than letters. She stopped by Mrs. Carter's bakery, where the smell of currant buns and clotted cream tarts hung in the air like perfume. Well, Mrs. Carter exclaimed. Miss Marple, back in Marleycombe. That poor Mr. Fane, such a shock. And the house buzzing with police. Did you know there's talk the will was burned on purpose? Miss Marple nodded kindly. People do get terribly worked up. I talk of money and death. And did you hear, Mrs. Carter continued, lowering her voice, that young Julian came into quite a bit of debt last year? They say he took out loans against his inheritance. As if that weren't counting chickens before the hatch. Miss Marple's eyes didn't miss the sly pleasure behind Mrs. Carter's gossip. Debt does make people impatient. And desperate, added Miss Greeley, who had joined them from the flower stall outside. I never liked him, truth be told. Always a bit theatrical. Miss Marple thanked them both and wandered off, her mind already stitching a quiet tapestry. She returned to the hall just in time to find Mr. Lathbury, the family solicitor, arriving in his brown wool overcoat, a battered briefcase in hand. I came to check on the old will, he explained. It's intact, filed in my office, dated last October. Everything goes to Julian Locke, stock and manor. And the new one? Miss Marple asked. Lathbury sighed. I witnessed Archie sign it not 3 weeks ago. It was here in that study. Cordelia was present. He was clear-headed, intent on diversifying the inheritance. Would it surprise you, Miss Marple asked, to learn that several people had the opportunity to burn it? Lathbury frowned. The new will hadn't been filed yet. Archie was still reviewing some amendments. If it was burned, it must have been someone in this house. But why destroy it, unless they had something to gain? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Indeed. Why, indeed. That evening, as the fog returned to settle over Marleycombe like a second skin, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room alone, a notebook. Open on her lap, she wrote one name at the top of the page. Julian, then below it, debts. Entered study at 7 on sleeve, per Mrs. Gull motivation. Inheritance next, she wrote. Cordelia witnessed new will, would receive modest inheritance letter to me guilt, or truth. Then, R.S.G. will possible beneficiary saw Julian, fearful hiding something deeper. And finally, Ewan Keano Demner, butler, outside. Influence? She put the notebook down. A will had been written. A man had died. A document had been turned to Ashdod, but Miss Marple knew well. In a village like Marleycombe, secrets always leave embers behind. Chapter 5. Gossip at the tea shop. The next morning, the village stirred beneath a veil of drizzle, that fine English sort of rain which never quite soaks, but lingers like an uninvited guest. Miss Marple stepped out of Marleycombe Hall armed with her umbrella, her sensible walking shoes, and a quiet determination to listen. She made her way to the Rose Petal Tea Room, a cozy little place tucked between the village post office and the draper's shop. It was the kind of establishment where lace curtains softened the sunlight, the silverware had history, and opinions flowed more freely than the Earl Grey. Inside, the room was already abuzz. 3 ladies sat at the corner table, beneath a watercolor of sheep in a meadow. Mrs. Agnes Sims, Miss Clara Yates, and Mrs. Doreen Hatch, all long-time residents and connoisseurs of village drama. Miss Marple chose a small table beside them, and ordered her usual weak Darjeeling and a toasted scone with butter. Not jam. She didn't need to wait long. I'm telling you, Mrs. Sims said, her voice just below a whisper. It's not natural for a man like Archibald Fane to just drop dead like that. He was walking 2 miles a day up to last week. And that business about the will, added Miss Yates, her sharp nose twitching with glee. Gone, burnt to ash. Poof. Cordelia must be beside herself, sighed Mrs. Hatch. If Julian inherits everything well, it's no secret they never got on. Miss Marple kept her eyes on her teacup. She tried to marry for love, didn't she? Said Miss Yates, ran off with that poet. But when that fell apart, she came back, didn't she? And Mr. Fane, bless him, took her in. I heard he was going to leave the money to the hospital and the housekeeper, whispered Mrs. Sims. Mrs. Gull, you know, I always thought she was a bit too comfortable in that house. Too close. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet cough. The women stiffened slightly, but made no move to lower their voices. And did you know, Mrs. Hatch added, Julian had to sell his car last summer? Gambling, I heard. Or something worse. There's talk from a solicitor's clerk in Elmsworth, something about unpaid debts. Men like him never wait long to get their claws in, said Miss Yates. Miss Marple stirred her tea once more and rose. As she passed their table, she paused, just slightly. Always such a pleasure to hear the truth as it wanders, she said softly, smiling, before leaving 3 astonished faces behind. Back at Marleycombe Hall, Miss Marple found the gardener, Mr. Peel, clipping dead blooms near the hedge. Good morning, she called gently. A fine job you've done with the roses. May I trouble you a moment? Mr. Peel straightened slowly. He was a tall man, weathered, with the slow, thoughtful manner of someone used to silence. Yes, miss? I wonder, Miss Marple said, if you happen to see anything unusual the morning Mr. Fane passed away. Did you know, Mrs. Gull? Miss Marple began softly. That foxglove grows quite beautifully beneath the south hedge. Mrs. Gull looked up from her knitting. It does. I've kept it from the younger staff, warned them. It's deadly. If used wrong, but used right, it can slow a heart. Or stop it. Double quotes. Mrs. Gull didn't reply. Miss Marple continued. And you used to nurse your mother, didn't you? I remember Cordelia once mentioning it. Mrs. Gull nodded slowly. Years ago, I kept her alive longer than the doctors expected. But yes, I learned how to use certain things, carefully. Did Mr. Fane know you had that knowledge? Mrs. Gull swallowed. He did. He trusted me. He knew I'd never use it against him. Miss Marple leaned in, but someone did. Mrs. Gull set down her knitting. You think I poisoned him? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that you had reason, motive, and access. The housekeeper's face grew pale. But, Miss Marple added, I also think someone may have tried to make it look that way. Mrs. Gull's eyes searched hers. Then you believe me? I believe, said Miss Marple softly, that there's still more truth buried in this house than out in the garden. That night, Miss Marple updated her notebook again. Suspect, JLA in motive, strong, inheritance, reputation, opportunity, present early, ash on sleeve, alibi, weak, witnessed vaguely, but fire plus poison equals too subtle. Suspect, MRS, dual motive, disinherited by loss of new will. Knowledge of poison. Glove equals hers. Present in study. But seems honest. And frightened. New suspicion. Frame job someone used both suspects' weaknesses. Subtle hand, observant, calculating. Beneath it, she added a single name in pencil, one she hadn't dared write yet. Then she closed the book. Chapter 10. A Whisper. In the attic the next morning, the house stirred more quietly than usual. Julian was still being held for questioning. Cordelia had not come down for breakfast. Mrs. Gall moved about the hall like a faded shadow. Even Graves, ever proper, seemed slow in his duties, his tray slightly off-center, the silver less polished than usual. Miss Marple took her tea in the morning room, and then asked a question she had not yet voiced. "Graves," she said mildly, "was there ever anyone else who had access to the study? Not the key, but access. Perhaps through less obvious means?" Graves blinked. "Well, madam, there is an attic door that leads to the old servant staircase. It's never used, now sealed. From the top, I believe. But in theory?" He trailed off. "In theory," Miss Marple finished, "someone could slip in and out without being seen. Even if the main door was locked." Graves cleared his throat. "I'll fetch the attic key, shall I?" 10 minutes later, Miss Marple followed him up the old staircase. The attic smelled of mothballs and forgotten summer's old trunks, yellowed sheets, and the faint scent of lavender oil. The door to the hidden servant stairs was half concealed behind a cabinet. Graves pulled it aside and unlocked the latch. It creaked open. The narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness. Miss Marple stepped carefully. The air was colder here, untouched by sunlight. And halfway down, on the small wooden landing, she found something unexpected, a scarf, thin silk floral. She picked it up with care. It was scented faintly with rosewater, and then she knew. She descended the final steps, emerging behind the panel in the far corner of the study. It was cleverly hidden. Unless one knew it was there, it would appear to be a solid wall. Miss Marple stepped out into the study and turned just as Cordelia entered the room. She froze. "Jane," Cordelia said softly, "you found it." Miss Marple folded the scarf and placed it gently on the desk. "Cordelia," she said, "I must ask, why did you hide the truth?" Cordelia's face crumpled, not in guilt, but in exhaustion. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, "but I found him that night. I came through the attic stairs. I wanted to speak to him privately, without Julian knowing. I knew he was preparing the new will, and I wanted to tell him I didn't want anything, that it would only cause trouble." She paused, eyes brimming. "But when I arrived, he was cold. The fire was still burning. And the envelope was gone." "And the will?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Destroyed. I saw the ashes. I panicked. I thought if they knew I'd been there, I'd be blamed. I dropped my scarf in the rush. I was terrified." Miss Marple reached across the desk and took her hand. "You were frightened. That's understandable. But Cordelia, someone else was there that night. Someone who did poison him." Cordelia's voice broke. "I thought it was Julian. I hated him for it. But now—" She hesitated. "Jane, there's something I never told anyone. The day before Archie died, I saw Mr. Lathbury, the solicitor, arguing with him in the rose garden. I wasn't close enough to hear words, but I saw Archie throw a letter at him. Lathbury looked furious. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And did you see what happened to the letter?" Cordelia shook her head. "No, but Lathbury stormed off without it." Miss Marple stood. "Then I think," she said, "it's time Mr. Lathbury and I had a very specific conversation." That evening, as rain returned to the skies of Marleycombe, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Lathbury's office in the village. He was surprised to see her. "I wasn't expecting company," he said stiffly. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but murder rarely sends an invitation." She sat in the worn leather chair across from his desk. His fingers twitched over a stack of paperwork. "I know about the argument," she said, "in the garden. And I know you were angry. But anger alone doesn't kill." Lathbury's face darkened. "You don't understand." "I think I do," she said calmly. "Archibald Fane wanted to alter his will. He intended to remove Julian and limit your executor role. He had grown suspicious of you, hadn't he? Lathbury's expression changed, something flickered. He accused me of mismanaging funds, Lathbury said. It wasn't true. But he wouldn't listen. He threatened to report me, disbar me. And so you poisoned him? No, Lathbury snapped. I didn't have to. I convinced him to delay the new will, to let me revise it. I thought I could talk him down. But he refused. He hesitated. The day he died, I wasn't even in Marleycombe. I was in Elmsworth with my wife. I have alibis. Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was truth in his panic, but not the whole truth. She rose slowly. Then I must ask you to consider this, Mr. Lathbury. If you didn't kill Archibald Fane, who benefited most from his death and the destruction of the new will? Lathbury said nothing, but Miss Marple knew. She was almost at the end now. Chapter 11. A face at the window. The wind had grown sharper that night, whispering through the trees like voices behind doors. At Marleycombe Hall, shadows shifted with unease. The truth was closing in like footsteps on gravel. Quiet and unmistakable. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her room, rereading her notebook one last time. Key facts. Mr. Fane intended to sign a new will. Beneficiaries changed. Julian stood to inherit everything under the old will. The new will was last seen on the study desk, burned in the morning fire. Mrs. Gull, Miss Marple said, I found a glove, singed, in the study drawer. The housekeeper froze. I believe it's yours. Mrs. Gull sat slowly. I didn't mean to hide it. I was going to mend it. But when the will went missing, you panicked. Miss Marple finished for her. Mrs. Gull nodded. I didn't burn it. I swear. I went into dust, saw the fire had been used, and I must have dropped the glove as I checked the grate. Did you see the will? I saw the envelope on his desk. It had the seal. But the next day, it was gone. Miss Marple studied her face. And what were you and Julian arguing about 2 days prior? Mrs. Gull flushed. He accused me of trying to worm into Archie's good graces for money. I told him loyalty wasn't something you bought. And he threatened you? No, she said. Then after a pause, yes, not directly. But he said, you may think you've earned a place in this house, but I decide what's yours. And what isn't. Miss Marple stood. Thanked you. That was very helpful. Later that night, alone in her room, Miss Marple added 3 new lines to her notebook. Red wax matches Lathbury's seal. Glove equals. Mrs. Gull confessed, but didn't see the will itself burned. Julian threatened her, and had motive. And access. She underlined access twice. Then she closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. The fire had been lit. The will destroyed. The ashes still whispered someone's guilt, but the embers were cooling, and Miss Marple was getting closer to the one who struck the match. Chapter 8. Secrets in the garden. The next morning, the sky was unusually clear, for spring blue stretching across Marleycombe like freshly washed linen. Miss Marple used the opportunity to stroll the gardens, taking the long path behind the rose hedges, beyond the yew trees, toward the far edge of the property, where the lilacs were just beginning to bud. It was here, behind the lilac bush, that something caught her attention. The earth beneath one of the shrubs had been recently disturbed, just a patch, faint and uneven. Not a gardener's tidy digging, but something quick, nervous. She crouched slowly and pressed her gloved fingers to the soil. Loose. Curious now, she reached into her knitting bag and pulled out the small silver trowel she carried for her herb pots. With careful hands, she brushed the earth away. What she uncovered was not buried deep. A pocket watch, old and slightly tarnished, rested beneath the soil. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, brushing off the dirt with a handkerchief. It was a gentleman's. Watch Edwardian style, with a cracked glass face and initials engraved on the back. A.F. Archibald Henry Fane. Miss Marple murmured Dot. She turned the watch over. The chain was broken, the clasp bent. It had not fallen accidentally. It had been hidden. She straightened, her mind already racing. The gardener had said Mr. Fane went to bed as usual, that he had locked the study, that he died in his sleep. But if the watch had been torn from his waistcoat, hidden beneath a bush, then perhaps he had not died quite so peacefully after all. Dot back inside the hall. She found Inspector Latham seated in the drawing-room with Cordelia, looking grim. "Miss Marple," he said, rising slightly. "You've arrived at a timely moment. We've received the full toxicology report." Cordelia froze. "Toxicology?" Latham nodded. "The local coroner wasn't satisfied with heart failure. Sent off a blood sample. And it seems Mr. Fane didn't simply die. He was poisoned." Cordelia's teacup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Latham continued. "Digitalis, extracted from foxglove. Small dose enough to mimic cardiac failure in an older man. Very subtle." Cordelia's voice trembled. "But who would do such a thing?" Latham looked between them. "Whoever stood to gain the most from his death. And now, from the destruction of the will." Miss Marple cleared her throat. "Then I believe I may have something else for you." She placed the pocket watch gently on the table. "This," she said, "was buried under a lilac bush at the edge of the garden, with the clasp broken." Latham's eyes widened. "This is Fane's. I saw it in photographs." "Where did you find it?" "Hidden," Miss Marple said calmly. "Which raises the question. Why would someone wish to dispose of a broken watch unless it had been involved in a struggle?" Cordelia whispered, "You think he was attacked?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone entered his room that night. Perhaps to confront him, perhaps to reason with him. But something went wrong." Inspector Latham nodded slowly. "And if he fought back, grabbed at a sleeve, a wrist, the watch could have broken in the scuffle." Miss Marple looked down at the shattered face of the timepiece. "It stopped at 11:08 p.m. "Which means," Latham said, standing, "he didn't die quietly in his sleep. He died struggling, poisoned, and likely frightened." Cordelia covered her mouth, horror creeping into her expression. "Whoever did this," Miss Marple said, "wanted us to believe it was natural. That's why they destroyed the will. That's why they buried the watch." Latham nodded grimly. "We'll bring in Julian for further questioning." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in the library, her fingers resting gently on the embroidery in her lap. Outside, the wind rustled the lilac leaves, faint, breathy, like secrets murmuring. In the dark, she glanced once more at her notebook. The list of suspects hadn't changed, but the stakes had. Now it wasn't just about inheritance. It was about murder. Chapter 9. The foxglove in the frame. The following morning, Marleycombe woke with a tremor beneath its usual calm. Word had spread. Murder. Not whispered, but declared. By noon, Julian Fane had been taken in for questioning. Miss Marple, seated by the window in the drawing-room, watched the local constable's car disappear down the gravel drive. The wheels turned slowly, as if the village itself were reluctant to let go of the man inside. Cordelia sat across from her, hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I can't believe it," she said quietly. "Julian may be arrogant, even cruel, but—" "Murder?" Miss Marple looked out the window, her voice calm. "Murder is often committed by the proud, especially when pride is wounded." Cordelia said nothing, but her gaze dropped to her hands. "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "was Julian ever interested in botany?" Cordelia blinked. "Botany?" "Yes, in particular." "The growing of foxglove." She shook her head. "No, I don't think so. Why?" Miss Marple stood and walked slowly toward the French windows. then out into the back garden. The foxglove was blooming along the southern border tall, bell-shaped flowers as beautiful as they were deadly. Their speckled purple throats seemed to whisper warnings. She knelt beside one plant, inspecting the soil. Someone had recently disturbed it. A small section of earth had been flattened, pressed by a shoe. She leaned closer and spotted something barely visible beneath a fallen petal. A glass dropper bottle tiny, corked and half-bashed buried. Miss Marple plucked it delicately from the soil with a handkerchief. In the kitchen, she presented the bottle to Inspector Latham, who had returned from the station with a thin, troubled expression. "She's right," he said after a moment. "It smells faintly of foxglove tincture. Someone's been distilling it themselves, illegally and dangerously." Miss Marple nodded. "Not something Julian would have the patience or skill for, I think." Latham frowned. "He denies everything. Says he never touched the study fire, never poisoned his uncle, and has an alibi he was writing letters in the library until midnight." Graves vaguely confirmed seeing him there. "Vaguely," Miss Marple repeated. "That's rarely useful." "What are you thinking?" Latham asked. "I'm thinking," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Julian is arrogant, yes, but he isn't subtle, and poisoning requires subtlety." Latham looked up. "You think someone's framing him?" "I think someone counted on him not being believed, on his reputation doing the work for them." She paused. "And I think we need to look more closely at who knows their way around both a study fire and a foxglove root." That evening, after supper, Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Gull. The housekeeper had been quieter since Julian's arrest, not mournful, but almost cautious. C.F. Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it inside her Bible. Then she sat at her writing desk, poured herself a small cup of elderflower cordial, and looked out the window at the soft, shifting clouds. Another case had ended, not with triumph, with truth. And in the end, that was always enough. Chapter 14. Justice and quiet things. 2 weeks passed. Marleycombe Hall stood quieter now, but not dead. Birds still nested in the ivy, and the roses had begun to climb again, unaware that death had lingered in the halls below. Cordelia Fane's arrest had not brought scandal. The villagers, perhaps guided by Miss Marple's silent example, spoke. Less of gossip and more of sorrow. Not pity, exactly, but something gentler. Understanding, maybe. At the village courthouse, Cordelia pled guilty. The judge, a stern man from Gloucester, sentenced her to 7 years with the possibility of parole in 4. He acknowledged the emotional strain, the long caretaking, the fragile mind under pressure. A tragic act, he said in his final words. Not from hatred, but from despair. And yet a life was taken, and justice must hold steady. Cordelia nodded once. No tears, only a strange peace. She didn't look at Miss Marple in the courtroom, but she sent another letter later. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resumed her rhythm. Tea at 4, garden deadheading, weekly church bazaars. But in the quiet moments, especially those dusky hours just before evening, she often thought of Cordelia and of Archibald Fane, a man proud and reclusive, who had tried too late, perhaps to make amends. One afternoon, Inspector Latham visited. He brought a small parcel, the broken pocket. Watch, cleaned and repaired. "I thought you might want to keep it," he said. "You found the truth faster than all of us combined." Miss Marple turned it over in her hands. It still bore the initials IHF, but now it ticked again, softly, purposefully. "Do you believe justice was served?" Latham asked. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "Justice," she said at last, "is rarely a full circle. It's more like a thread that stops fraying. Enough, sometimes, just to stop the unraveling." He nodded, thoughtful. "Will you take another case soon?" I never take them, she smiled. They simply arrive. That evening, as twilight curled around the hedgerows and lamplight blinked on in windows across the village, Miss Marple wrote the final line in her small, brown leather journal. Marleycombe burnt will. Justice quiet, not cruel. A woman unmade. A house remembered. A truth restored. She closed the book. Outside, the church bell rang softly in the dusk, and inside, Miss Marple poured her tea and let the world be still. Epilogue. Lilacs in bloom. It was late spring by the time. The lilacs bloomed again in Marleycombe, the bush near the far edge of the Hall's garden, once the resting place of a broken watch, now burst into pale purple flowers, fragrant. Unaware of their role in a darker story. Miss Marple returned, not out of curiosity, but because she had promised herself she would. The groundskeeper greeted her kindly and let her walk the perimeter alone. She paused by the lilac and bent slightly, fingertips brushing the earth. The soil was firm again. No trace of secrets now. Just roots and petals and the slow, steady work of healing. Back at St. Mary Mead, the days grew longer. The church held a small service in memory of Archibald Fane, not formal, not grand. Just quiet hymns, some old photos, and one paragraph in the village newsletter. It read, "Though Marleycombe has known sorrow this spring, it has also known grace. The truth, though painful, has set many hearts to rest. May we never forget that sometimes justice comes not with noise, but with gentleness and with the wisdom of those who watch when others do not." Miss Marple sat one morning in her garden, pruning roses, when a small envelope arrived by post. The paper was thick. The address written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a pressed lilac bloom, and a short note. "Jane, there is still time. They say to grow again. I intend to try." I think he would have wanted that .c.f. Miss Marple smiled faintly, placed the lilac between the pages of her gardening book, and went back to her roses, because life, like a garden, must be tended, even after fire, especially after fire. Pocket watch hidden suggests a struggle. Poison digitalis, found in his system extracted from foxglove. Glove, singed, belonged to Mrs. Gall, found in the study. Cordelia entered via secret staircase. Found him dead. Lathbury had motive but a confirmed alibi. And yet there was one thing still out of place. A piece that refused to sit quietly. She walked the corridor and paused, outside Mrs. Gull's room. The housekeeper answered with tired eyes. "You're still awake?" Miss Marple stepped in. "One last question, dear. Just one." Mrs. Gull nodded. Warily. "Who was in the hall the night before Archie died?" Mrs. Gull hesitated. "I don't know. I went to bed early. But around 11, I thought I heard someone in the corridor." "Did you see them?" "No, but there was a light. A shadow, someone moving toward the east wing." Miss Marple thanked her and turned to leave. But something in Mrs. Gull's expression caught her attention. "Is there something you haven't told me?" The woman paused. "Only this I found. The poison bottle. The tiny glass one. It wasn't buried in the garden." Miss Marple stopped cold. "Where did you find it?" "In the drawing room. Slipped between the cushion and armrest. I panicked. I thought they'd blame me. So I took it out into the garden and buried it under the foxglove." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "You didn't recognize it?" "No, I've never seen it before." It was nearing midnight when Miss Marple returned to the drawing room. The fire had gone out. The silence had settled thick. She walked over to the sofa, the one Cordelia always used. She looked at the cushion. And suddenly, everything locked into place. The dropper bottle had not been planted to frame. Julian. It had been hidden after use. Not by Julian. Not by Mrs. Gull. Not by the solicitor. Miss Marple stood very still. Her voice, almost inaudible. It was her. Cordelia was in the library when Miss Marple entered. "I've been waiting," Cordelia said. "You know, don't you?" Miss Marple sat across from her, the flickering lamplight casting deep shadows. "I do." Cordelia's face didn't change. "He was going to cut me out too, Jane. Not just Julian. Everyone. He said we'd all been a disappointment, that he was giving the money to charity. A library in his name. Can you imagine?" "I don't need to imagine," Miss Marple said softly. "I saw the pain in your eyes, and the fear after." "But Cordelia, you didn't need to kill him." Cordelia's voice was brittle. "No? Then what would I be left with? A ruined name, no money, no life. He gave Julian everything and expected me to smile and thank him. So you made the tea." Cordelia looked away. "You crushed the foxglove yourself," Miss Marple continued. "Dissolved it in warm milk, perhaps, or his evening drink. You knew the dose, just enough. You waited for him to fall asleep, then took the new will from his desk and fed it to the fire." Cordelia said nothing. "The broken watch," Miss Marple said, "you didn't expect. He struggled, even while dying. It caught on your wrist. You buried it in the garden the next morning. And the poison bottle? Hidden in the drawing room beneath. Your own cushion." Cordelia's hands trembled. "You knew the investigation would point to Julian," Miss Marple said gently. "You relied on his arrogance to do the rest. And Mrs. Gall, you let her panic. You let her bury the evidence for you." Cordelia whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go so far." "But it did," Miss Marple said. "And now it must come to an end." Cordelia closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. "You'll turn me in?" Miss Marple stood slowly. "The law must know the truth, but so must you." She turned toward the door, pausing only once. "You were loved, Cordelia. He didn't leave you nothing. You just never read the last letter he wrote. It was in his desk sealed. Left unburned?" Cordelia froze. "What letter?" "He left you the house," Miss Marple said. "The new will changed the cash inheritance." "Yes, but the house was always meant for you. He was trying to protect you from Julian." Cordelia's sob escaped like a gasp of air from a long-held breath, and Miss Marple walked quietly away, leaving the silence behind. Chapter 12. The Confession. The morning dawned still and gray, the light creeping slowly across the rooftops of Marleycombe, as if reluctant to shine on what had passed. Cordelia sat alone in the small conservatory, wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes, red-rimmed and distant, watched the damp garden beyond the glass miss. Marple arrived not long after breakfast. She moved gently, carrying a small envelope in her hand, the one found in Archibald Fane's desk, its seal still intact. Cordelia didn't look up. "I suppose you've brought it," she said. "The letter." Miss Marple nodded and held it out. Cordelia took it in both hands, hesitated, then broke the seal with trembling fingers. She read in silence. Her lips parted once, then closed again. When she finally looked up, her face was a portrait of devastation. "I thought he hated me," she whispered. "I thought he never forgave me for leaving with Edward. I assumed he saw me as a failure." Miss Marple sat opposite her. "We all assume too much, I'm afraid." Cordelia held the letter tighter. "He wrote that he understood, that he knew I needed to try. He said he was proud that I had come back stronger, that he trusted me to take care of the house. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you killed him." Cordelia didn't deny it. "I acted before I read." "Before?" "I asked. I was angry, humiliated. I felt abandoned." "But he was never the enemy, was he?" "No," Miss Marple said. "The enemy was fear, pride, and the belief that people can't change their minds." Cordelia looked down. "And what happens now?" Before Miss Marple could answer, The door opened. Inspector Latham stepped in, hat in hand. "Miss Fane," he said, "I've come to hear your account, your full account." Cordelia stood slowly. She placed the letter gently on the table and turned toward him. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "No more hiding, no more pretending." Latham gave a single nod. "Then let's begin." Later that day, after Cordelia had been taken into custody quietly, without spectacle, Miss Marple returned to her cottage in St. Mary Mead. She sat with her knitting. The needle paused mid-loop. A village death was always tragic, but one born from misunderstanding, from love twisted by silence. That left deeper marks. She had seen too many cases where the real motive wasn't money or revenge, but loneliness. Graves had said it best, the morning of the funeral. It's not always hatred that kills, miss. Sometimes it's the ache of never being heard. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the thread winding steadily forward. Stitch by stitch, life would continue in Marleycombe, but some hearts would carry a quiet burn forever. Chapter 13. The village reacts in Marleycombe. News travels not by phone or telegram, but by teacup. By noon the next day, every cottage window seemed brighter, every front gate ajar. From the bakery to the post office, voices lowered and heads leaned in. Cordelia Fane. Imagine? And all these years we thought she was the quiet one. Such a shame about poor Mr. Fane. Always kept to himself, but kind. Do you think she'd go to prison? Well, it was murder, wasn't it? But it doesn't feel like it somehow. Miss Marple walked the high street that morning, nodding gently to villagers, who offered her awkward half-curtsies and glances, filled with both admiration and dread. Outside the greengrocer's, she paused to speak with Mrs. Kingsley, the vicar's wife, who wore sorrow the way others wore perfume elegantly and excessively. "I heard you uncovered everything, Jane," she whispered. "You always see what the rest of us don't." "I saw what people weren't saying," Miss Marple replied. "That's often where the truth lives." Double quotes. Mrs. Kingsley's eyes were soft. "Will you be testifying?" "If called," Miss Marple sighed. "But I expect Cordelia will plead guilty. She doesn't seem inclined to delay justice." "She loved him," Mrs. Kingsley said. "She did," Miss Marple agreed. "But love and fear are closer cousins than we like to admit." At Marleycombe Hall, Graves resumed his duties with stiff dignity. The drapes were drawn back. The study remained closed, sealed by the inspector's orders. But the rest of the house had begun to breathe again. The vicar stopped by to bless the home. No one had the heart to host a gathering, but Mrs. Gall brought lemon cake to the servants' kitchen, and the youngest maid set out mismatched china, as if that act alone might stitch something back together. "I suppose we all knew Cordelia was different," one of the footmen whispered. "But not like that." "No," Mrs. Gall replied, her voice low. "Not like that." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter. It arrived unmarked, slipped through the door without a stamp. Inside, folded neatly, was a note written in Cordelia's hand. "Jane, they've been kind. Merciful, even. The solicitor confirmed I will be allowed to keep the house when I'm released, just not the rest. I'll serve my time. I'll pay for what I did. But it was your letter, the one you found from Uncle Archie, that undid me. It made me remember who I used to be, and how far I'd let bitterness lead me from that girl. Thank you, not just for solving the mystery, but for saving a part of me I thought was already dead."